Any Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the March edition of the PHJV webinar. Today, I'd like to introduce Corey White. He'll be speaking to us today about Saskatchewan agricultural water management strategy. Corey, whenever you're ready, please feel free.
Perfect, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today to share some information about the progress to date on Saskatchewan's agricultural water management strategy, including our approach to wetlands. So just to give you kind of a teaser of where we'll go today, I'm going to start by leading you through some of the history in terms of setting up how Saskatchewan got to where we are today. Then I'll touch on some of the regulatory considerations, particularly those which empower our agricultural water management strategy. I'll follow that up by providing some of the details and key concepts of our approach. And I'll end by touching on some information about our next steps, most of which are currently focused on building trust and relationships, and as well as collaborating and ensuring that we have links to other provincial initiatives and strategies. So here we go. Like I said, I'd like to start by setting the stage in terms of the history of drainage in the province and our current state. I believe this provides us with some context to understand where we are today as it relates to a wetland policy, as well as our drainage regulations. So as many of you know, agriculture has been a part of the Saskatchewan landscape for well over 100 years. Drainage activities started here in the province as it did in much of Western Canada approximately 200 years ago. In the early 1900s, this was often channelization or channel modification that was used to increase conveyance or offer better outlets. In Saskatchewan particularly, there were additional modifications to enhance drainage in areas of the pothole regions, specifically because they were considered areas that were not well drained. This was often hard work. It was done by hand or animal power, but there was a real push that came in the early 1920s during a wet period. So in Saskatchewan particularly, we saw some of that pothole region drainage expand to allow for some of that wet area or some of that wet cycle to be reduced so that there could be support for increased development of the agricultural lands here. As many of you know, since then we've seen increased pressures related to both the weather cycle as well as the economics and other innovative things like new equipment, technology that allows agriculture as well as drainage to expand into areas that maybe weren't open for development. And it's allowed this activity to become more widespread across the province. During those 100 years, you know, there was a lot of work done, and the government of the day in the early 1980s made some significant changes in the legislation. They decided at this point that any unapproved drainage works constructed prior to 1981 did not require an approval. However, any drainage works constructed after 1981 required an approval. This approach, which I'm going to call our historic approach to compliance, was really a complaint-based system. So it was focused on demonstrating first-party damages and resolving neighbor-to-neighbor conflict. For example, if a farmer was concerned that he or she was being flooded out because their neighbor's drainage works were flooding onto them, the impacted farmer would need to contact Water Security Agency to start an investigation. This approach proved to be widely ineffective. Compliance rates between 1981 and 2014 were, you know, approximately 5% or less. And we also know that this practice of drainage did not stop. In fact, it continued into what we see on the landscape today. And what that is, so what do we actually see today? Drainage now plays a role in current agricultural practices, and the scale and magnitude of drainage is much greater than it has been in the past. Currently in Saskatchewan, we estimate that there are more than 1,800 miles of organized drainage ditches draining an estimated 4.5 million acres of farmland. We've approximated that there is 150,000 quarter sections of unapproved drainage in the province, and that's estimated to be approximately 16 million to 24 million acres of land that has unapproved drainage. So we have a really deep ingrained history, which leaves me with where to go next. So the next steps here are our new approach and what that means for us. So this new approach was really brought to the forefront, and the impetus was created during the 2011 and 2014 flooding situations. At that point, there were some issues being identified, and a new strategy started to be kind of incubated. It led to some changes in our regulations in 2015, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes. But before I do that, I just want to go through what the current regulatory environment looks like as it pertains to wetlands in the province. So there's a number of different acts and regulations out there. First of which is the Water Security Agency Act, as well as the supporting Water Security Agency regulations. We have the Environmental Management and Protection Act 2010. So this is also known as EMPA 2010. Sorry, losing my voice. There we go. The Conservation and Development Act, as well as those regulations, and the Watershed Association Act. So there's a number of different pieces of legislation out there that both consider and support wetlands, as well as drainage activities. Much of what I'm going to focus on today is really those top three, being the Water Security Agency Act, the Water Security Agency regulations, and a little bit of EMPA. So I'm going to start pretty high here in terms of high level. We have these pieces of legislation out there that provide us some direction and empower us to think about certain things. But at a really high level, the Water Security Agency acts under the 25-year Saskatchewan Water Security Plan. Within this plan, we have a vision that articulates that water supports economic growth, quality of life, and environmental well-being. Under this, we recognize that we need to protect both the quality and quantity of water now and into the future, so that we can ensure that all residents of the province have sustainable water supplies, safe drinking water, are protected, have protection of our water resources, as well as have protection from flood and damage. This really provides us an overarching view and sets us up for managing water as a public resource for all of the residents, or all of the residents in the province. The agricultural water management strategy has been born out of a call to action in that 25-year plan. So the purpose of our strategy is to provide the strategic direction to guide agricultural water management decisions for the long term for all residents of Saskatchewan, remembering that we have a responsibility to ensure that all residents in the province have access to safe water. The way I think about this is that residents of the province need to have the right amount of water with the right quality at the right time. So there's a couple specific pieces in the 25-year plan that include assessing the range of alternatives and implementing strategic actions to manage drainage, developing a results-based approach to the drainage works approval process and associated enforcement strategies, developing new strategies to address moisture concerns on agricultural lands, including information and advice on proper drainage design, and considering the benefits of wetland retention and restoration. All of which presents a challenge in terms of designing a public policy that meets the needs that all were mandated to consider. So that includes stakeholders on all sides of this issue. To meet this call to action, we started by making significant changes to our regulations. So thinking back to that slide a couple slides ago, when I'm talking about the regulations here, it's the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency regulations. These changes empowered us to manage the impacts associated with flooding, water quality, and habitat for now and into the long term, and it also empowers us to think about the cumulative effects. In addition, these regulations remove the pre-1981 grandfathering clause. As such, our approvals and mitigation will apply to all existing and new development. We're still working towards finalizing our policies. We have some of our mitigation tools approved, but we're still working to develop a wholesome mitigation policy for Saskatchewan. I'll provide a little bit more detail on what we're thinking about in a few slides from now, but I'll provide kind of what we're thinking about in terms of mitigation policy, including our approach to wetlands. Lastly, we've been delivering the new program since 2017. So we've started off with some pilot projects to test things to determine what works and doesn't work. And since that time, we've approved over 4,000 quarter sections under the new system. Just to put that into perspective for you, this is already more quarter sections than ever approved under the previous 40 years of our past system. We've exceeded that by approximately 1,300 quarter sections, but it's only 2% of the estimated number of quarter sections that are currently unapproved out there. So we've done some work, we're learning, we're testing, we're bringing in more quarter sections than we ever have, but at the same time, we have a long way to go, and there's room to start to bring some of our new mitigation policies into place. So we're continuing to develop, and I'll speak to that over the next few slides. So before I jump into those details though, I do want to start with the vision of our agricultural water management strategy. So our vision is responsible drainage, supporting resilient watersheds and thriving communities. The intent here is really finding a balance that helps us to support sustainable agriculture while considering the environmental impacts and community relationships, including neighbor-to-neighbor impacts of flooding. We're hoping that we can take into consideration producer-making decisions, but also ensuring that we've got a focus on the environmental services provided. Now, I know that I stop, okay, so we're responsible drainage. This is a key part of our vision, but what does that really mean? So this is key to our overarching long-term vision, and provides the direction for the development of our mitigation approach. So responsible drainage is drainage that considers the impact, the risk, and appropriate mitigation. So the objective of our approach is an impact mitigation approach, and the focus is on understanding the impact and determining the intervention points or points that can be managed along the way. Our objective here is that flooding, water quality, and habitat impacts of drainage are mitigated or managed, and this aligns directly up to the changes that were made in our legislation. So that's our objective. What's an impact? So we've got a definition for impact too. You can drill it down a little bit further for each one of the impacts, but I'm just going to give you kind of the higher, larger definition here. So we have defined impact as the effects due to drainage that result in a change in the resource such that there is a reduction in the ability to use the resource or there is unreasonable harm. So our approach really places a focus on the ability to use the resource. This includes recreational uses, other uses such as watering livestock or irrigation, human consumption, or the ability to support sustainable game populations for hunting and recreational use. Our approach is also risk-based. So the second element of responsible drainage is risk. We consider risk at two scales, and risk drives a number of our decisions around mitigation requirements. We consider risk as the probability of an impact and the consequence of that impact if it were to occur. Our risk process, as I said, involves two scales, the first of which is where's the project in the province. We know that there are some areas in the province where the consequence is greater. For example, we have terminal basins, where flooding impacts would be exacerbated, or areas that drain into, sensitive recreational lakes or into Manitoba. And so those are layers or drivers underneath the what we would call our watershed vulnerability map, which is what you see here in the picture. The second piece of our risk assessment is how big is the project. So the bigger the project, the more extensive the drainage is, the more wetlands that have been included will have a greater impact that need to be addressed through the project design, mitigation requirements, and approval process. This process really provides us with a starting spot or the criteria to understand the impacts, but really the take-home message here is that the higher the risk, the more management or mitigation requirements are needed. The last part of responsible drainage is mitigation. So how are we defining mitigation? Mitigation includes the actions taken to avoid or eliminate the impacts or reduce the probability of significant negative impacts occurring. We're aligning with the mitigation hierarchy that includes avoidance, minimization, and offset. However, you see here that offset has an asterisk beside it as we're still working on developing this, and there's no formal policy in place yet that would allow for approved use of these tools. So it's still a conceptual thing at this point. So from here, I'm just going to move into a few key concepts. And I think here the first key concepts is what is a wetland. So we've defined responsible drainage, and I think we need to acknowledge that the other side of that coin is the wetland. If you've drained something, inevitably it's a wetland. So when we're talking about drainage, we need to consider what and how we're defining a wetland feature on the landscape. We have adopted the Canadian Wetland Classification System or definition of a wetland. This definition basically indicates that wetlands are features on the landscape that have the appropriate topography, so potholes or elevation that allow for water to sit long enough to do two things. The first one is to promote wetland soils, which are often related to the microbe community. And you're looking at kind of that shift to anaerobic microbes. And second, you're looking for that vegetation. So you're looking for that water-loving vegetation. Using this definition, we've included the typical prairie pothole wetlands, flowing and low-tick systems, as well as bogs and fens. So this definition provides a broad-ranging definition. I think the next question that comes out of this is, okay, so everything defined there is a wetland. How does your regulatory system consider that? Are there exemptions based on size or class? So currently, no. Currently, all wetland sizes and classes require an approval if they are drained, and our preliminary thinking around our mitigation approach considers the impacts to all sizes and classes. So remember, we are considering all drainage works, new and existing, and we're considering impacts to all wetland sizes and all wetland classes. Our wetland inventory data provides a baseline information for mapping this information, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but our qualified persons or WSA staff validates these features in the field. The next piece of our system is how we consider wetlands and drainage on the landscape and the scale at which our regulatory system is applied. We know from looking at the inventory data as well as working with landowners that they've already organized themselves into networks on the landscape. Networks can vary from a couple quarter sections to 200 quarter sections in size. On average, they seem to be somewhere around the 80 quarter section range. As such, we've landed on what we call a network approach. This approach allows us to take a more cumulative effect when looking at the impacts of it at the network scale. It allows us to address things like land control requirements and also provide some administrative efficiencies. The next piece is not necessarily a technical piece, but it's a piece that came into play under our regulatory changes, and that was having qualified persons. Under the new regulations, we've developed a qualified persons network, and this network is really a network of individuals that provide additional support to producers and applicants out there. What we're really looking for is the support required to achieve quality applications so that we can streamline our WSA review process, as well as ensuring that producers have the support they need to navigate the regulatory system. So next, I'm going to touch on the development of our mitigation approach, but just to summarize some of the key points here. Our previous program was really focused on a complaints-based system that really focused workloads on resolving complaints about the impacts. This program included an exemption for any works constructed prior to 1981. Land control was easements, which was often difficult and required was a difficult requirement to achieve, and we had very low compliance rates, less than 5%, which kind of led us to where we are today in terms of having, large scale drainage out there. Our new approach includes some key differences. The 1981 exemption's been removed, and all drainage, regardless of when it was built, requires an approval. The drainage of all wetland sizes and classes require an approval. Our regulations empowered WSA to consider impacts of drainage, including water quality, quantity, so flooding, and wildlife habitat. And there's a focus on implementation with the ag industry and community. Okay, so I know a key piece of all of this is mitigation, what's being considered and how it will work. I'll acknowledge right up front here that I'll likely leave you with a few questions today, as we're still continuing to work with our partners and stakeholders to really develop and finalize our mitigation policy. But I'll walk you through some of our thinking so far. The way we're approaching mitigation is from the impact mitigation perspective, including consideration and design on the network scale for all wetlands new and all drainage new and existing. When I think about our approach, I think of it as a toolbox or a suite of tools. We have a number of different tools available to us, but in some cases, the tools don't address all the needs. As such, we need to design and consider each project slightly differently, considering the impacts of each project. So the tools that are used in any given situation may look slightly different, but we're trying to apply the right tools to address the impacts that we know exist for that project. Our first step in understanding the impacts is our risk evaluation. So remember, this includes risk associated with where you are in the province and the size of the project. This allows us to both identify and understand the impacts, as well as understand and identify the proper regulatory tools required. We also need to keep in mind that our approach needs to be effective in reducing or eliminating the impacts. It needs to be practical, and it needs to be acceptable. So I'm just going to walk through each one of the impacts here. And the way I think about this as well is I think of these things as levers. So think about the ecological components or the things on the landscape that we can manage associated with each one of these impacts. So again, I'm thinking about levers, the things we can pull and how do we pull them. So for flooding, we can manage two things: the peak flows and the total volume. So peak flow is the point in the annual cycle where you have the most water flowing through the system. Drainage activities have been found to increase peak flows. The other piece that we have here is total volume. So this is the total amount of water that flows through the system during a given year or given cycle. Again, drainage has been found to increase your total volumes into the system. These relationships are really related to increasing the area or the effective drained area, as well as lost storage on the landscape. So what can we do to manage this? We have a few different tools in our toolbox, and they include having appropriate project design, as well as land control to manage potential flooding issues between neighbors. Flow controls can be installed to slow the water down. This helps to reduce total peak flow, but doesn't address the total volume. And last, including permanent wetland storage on the landscape can reduce both peak flows as well as total volume. Again, you see an asterisk beside this, as we're still working on our approach to what wetland storage looks like on the landscape. Last piece here is we have the ability to decline an application in situations where impacts cannot be mitigated or managed. So this may include such areas as terminal basins where flooding impacts are of a significant concern. The next impact here is water quality. Again, there's two elements here that we can focus on managing. They include concentration and total load. We know that for nutrients, there's a relationship between both the concentration and load and increases in drainage. So in particular, load is of interest to us as we see the relationship between increased drainage and the total volume of water driving total nutrient load. This seems to be driven by dissolved nutrients, which is of kind of particular interest because we need to think about ways to abate or address dissolved nutrients, not just particulate nutrients. So what do we have here? Again, we've got a suite of tools that we can use and apply. The first of which is flow controls. This can be used to partially address the water quality issues. This is mostly focused on slowing the water down to reduce erosion and particulate sediment, which is that kind of particulate nutrients. In addition, we have sediment and erosion control conditions. In many cases, this overlaps with those required by our Aquatic Habitat Protection Program, which is empowered under EMPA. This includes things like proper sloping, grassing, etc. The next piece here, again, which I'm sure you're going to start to see a trend here now, is permanent wetland storage on the landscape. We know that holding on to water in wetlands or some sort of permanent storage on the landscape reduces both the load of nutrients as well as the concentration. Again, that's asterisks because we don't have a finalized approach on that piece. Lastly, in situations where the impacts cannot be managed, we do have the ability to decline an application. The last piece here is habitat impacts. So this includes having habitat available to support both population level processes as well as biodiversity. We know that modifications of wetlands results in habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. So what can we do here? Again, we can decline applications in areas where the impacts can't be managed. For example, if we have species at risk critical habitat considerations. We can think about proper design, which includes avoidance of particular wetlands or certain circumstances. And lastly, obviously, there's keeping some wetland habitat on the landscape. So these pieces are all being considered as levers or things that we can manage, and we will add more when we know more. We're applying these approaches, design and approvals on the network scale, which allows us to move beyond the individual wetland and consider wetland complexes and larger scale cumulative impacts. It's important to recognize here that a full suite of tools are required to adequately address all of the impacts or pull all of those levers. As such, most projects will use a combination of approaches and tools, and wetlands are a key consideration of the approach as they're required to abate or manage the impacts of all three impacts here. So we've done some thinking and we've developed some ideas, but at the core here of any regulatory program or, honestly, any conservation program is people. In fact, many of the foundational principles of policing or regulatory programs is built on having public support. So I just want to talk a little bit here about building trust in some of our next steps. So at the core of this issue is the people, as in the citizens of Saskatchewan. This includes communities and families throughout the province. And we need to develop approaches and tools to support them in achieving success, as well as achieving the environmental benefits that we're looking for. The issues that have been raised about this approach, I think, often represent feelings of unfairness and perceptions about the way that people have been treated by neighbors and the government. These feelings, emotions, and attitudes are at the core of the questions and issues that we're being asked to solve. And it's important to recognize the human element part of these as we move forward. I think at the heart of our next steps here is really about engaging more and listening more to our stakeholders and building partnerships. So this includes listening and working with a range of stakeholders, including ENGO partners, ag stakeholders, as well as our other partners in government. So it's really based on bridging relationships and building trust. In the fall of 2019, we consulted with 45 stakeholder groups on our proposed approach to wetlands. It was the threshold approach, which many of you may have heard about or been involved in the stakeholder consultation process. We listened, and what we heard was that we had more work to do to improve our approach. As such, we're in the process of reevaluating our approach through a couple different ways. The first of which is the demonstration and research projects, which I'll give you a little bit more information on the next slide, as well as a new consultation and engagement approach. So our demonstration projects or demonstration and research projects were developed last year, I guess last year at this time, we were starting to move these forward. They've been advanced to develop and affirm support for our mitigation policy, which will include wetlands through partnerships. So really what we're looking at doing is testing tools and options that address the impacts and consider how they'll fit into our new approach and determine how effective they are at achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. So we're bringing together 10 partner groups to evaluate everything from wildlife responses to looking at some of the economics and agronomics of various mitigation options. I think the beauty of this initiative is that we're bringing together farmers, scientists, and other partners to develop, test, and monitor management practices and new technologies through a range of academic research into a real life context. So we've got 11 on the ground, what we call approval stream projects going on. We're working with networks of producers, and we're bringing in a number of different partners, you know, Sask Wildlife Federation, we're bringing in the Saskatchewan Research Council, PAMI, a number of different groups to evaluate different components of each one of these projects to determine if they meet our objectives, if they're practical, if they're acceptable, and if they can help inform our approach as we move forward. We're also looking at things like nutrient management at the ag in motion sites, and we'll be doing some additional examination of the economics as we move forward. So we're really continuing to develop our approach and rethink things. We'll be continuing to engage with and talk to a broad range of stakeholders. We'll be working in partnerships to test ideas and try new things. And really, this is all working towards a Made in Saskatchewan agricultural water management strategy. In particular, this Made in Saskatchewan mitigation policy that will consider wetlands. So we need to find an approach that works for the producer, the public, as well as our many other stakeholder groups. So just to end off here, I'd like to just highlight a number of other links to other provincial initiatives. First off, a foundational part of our approach is ensuring that we're supporting the Saskatchewan Growth Plan as well as the Prairie Resiliency or Climate Change Plan. There's a number of key and pretty explicit links related to safeguarding the health of our water systems to ensure the ability to both respond and adapt to a changing climate, as well as including retention and restoration of wetlands to build resilience to flooding, drought, as well as providing the ability to retain carbon. The next links is to our management of both the provincial fisheries as well as game resources. So we recognize that fish and game resources are considered a resource for use and are therefore managed as a public resource. Wetlands are a real key component of the habitat to support sustainable populations for harvest now and into the future. So we have been and we will continue to work with the Ministry of Environment to incorporate information about the habitat required to support these populations. We'll be looking at ways to incorporate that into our risk assessment processes, as well as into our proposed approach around wetland in our mitigation policy. Last is the Habitat Management Plan. So the Ministry of Environment is working on this large initiative, and wetlands are a key component of the landscape approach. We're continuing to work closely with Environment on the development of this plan, and when the indicators and targets are identified within this plan, we can start to incorporate them into our risk assessment process, as well as think about how it informs or integrates into our threshold approach to mitigation. So to summarize, Saskatchewan still has more work ahead of us. However, this strategy represents a significant change in the way that water has been managed on the landscape when we compare it to the past. As I mentioned in the beginning, this challenge has been 100 years or more in the making, and we're really embarking on a large-scale change that's going to require investment in producer support and the support of our many stakeholders out there. This change will take time, and we're wanting to take the time we need to get it right. We want to ensure that we can build something that is balanced and provides effective, practical, and achievable solutions. So although this work is still a work in progress, we're trying to get the best information we can to advance it forward. I'm hoping that the information that I provided today will provide a little bit of clarity, although I do understand that you probably have more questions. With that, we're still moving forward to continue to work with producers. We're working on increasing our networks of QPs out there. We're looking to increase communication, engagement, and we're looking forward to working with our partners. As we move into the future, we'll need to consider the perspectives of our partners and stakeholders, including, as I mentioned, industry, ENGOs, and our government partners. So with that, I'm happy to address any questions that folks might have out there.
Hey, Dave, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, it's Dave Sutherland. Thanks very much for doing this. I think you talk about consultation, and I think maybe there's been a component that has been not exercised as rigorously as it should be, which is the broader consultation, particularly with environmental groups. My question is about watershed management. It seems to me that there's two basic things that in terms of managing cumulative effects that are your eyes. One is water quality objectives on water bodies, and the other is wetland conservation objectives. What sizes, what classes, and how much of wetlands. I know that they're not easy questions to answer, but it seems to me to start with that, you need watershed management plans that are initiated with water quality objectives. And maybe you can tell me. I know I'm on the Capel system. I don't see that in place yet, and I'm wondering how prevalent is that approach being implemented throughout the province, especially the agricultural belt.
Yeah, and I can see the value of having those watershed plans in place. And I think that, I think that some of the planning processes at that more local level and some of the planning processes that we're thinking about have not been in lockstep with one another previously. Again, we're really kind of rethinking things right now and thinking through what opportunities exist. So there may be opportunities there, but I don't know what that's going to look like right now and how that might look in the future. So I know that's maybe not a direct answer to your question, Dave, but that's kind of where things are at right now.
Right. Will you build carbon sequestration into the strategy?
That's a great question. So right now we're working with the University of Saskatchewan to answer some questions about carbon, in particular, taking a look at the baseline carbon values within wetland components, as well as taking a look at some of the change factors associated with drainage or farming through wetlands. So I think it's a piece that we're looking at getting more information about and looking for those opportunities to build in where it's appropriate.
Okay. Are there any ecological considerations other than species at risk that would cause an application to be declined?
Currently, right now, species at risk is probably the major one that would drive that. Again, I think as some more information comes in from various other plans and pieces out there, there may be the potential that could happen, and it would be driven through the risk evaluation processes, both at the watershed vulnerability scale as well as at the local project scale.
Okay. How do the risk assessments of drainage consider cumulative effects on downstream jurisdictions?
Yeah, so some of the information driving those layers would include areas where we know we have potential water quality issues already. Some of those watersheds that are draining into Manitoba, as well as thinking about some of those other potentially vulnerable areas of Saskatchewan. That being said, I think that there's some additional work to maybe strengthen some of those connections within the risk assessment process.
Okay. The wetland definition used would seem to include any area where water has sat at any time, now or in the past, likely a huge amount of land. What do farmers think of this definition?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is the definition of wetlands that's been broadly accepted out there. It often will capture everything from wetland classes 2 and up. Ones are a little bit funny that way, in that some of the changes in the soil might not be as significant, but I mean, they're still considered wetlands. Working with producers to have a common understanding of wetlands is something that I think that we'll continue to do. And I think that there is an understanding, a changing understanding of what wetlands are on the landscape.
Why does the Prairie Resilience Plan not have any photos of wetlands?
I can't speak to the Prairie Resilience Plan. It's not our plan. I don't know why it doesn't have any pictures of wetlands. It speaks to wetlands within it, but I don't know why there's no pictures.
Are there any plans for pesticide monitoring in surface and groundwater?
Not that I know of currently under this strategy.
You've mentioned that you have built into the process the ability to decline applications. Judging from previous compliance, less than 5%, what are your plans and processes being put in place to deal with non-compliance and infractions?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So I think that we are moving forward with some focus on compliance activities. We have a new compliance assurance unit under the Agricultural Water Management branch that will focus on both RFAs, which are requests for assistance, as well as non-compliance activities. But this is something that we need to work towards slowly. So thinking about the foundation of a regulatory program, we need to ensure that we've got public support out there, as well as public trust. So we will be working towards those types of activities, and it will take time, but we're working on it. We acknowledge that there's a number of components in there, including monitoring, as well as tools. So again, it's a work in progress. I don't know what that's going to completely look like, but we're working towards what that will look like.
How have you been working with First Nations?
Yeah, so we've gone through some of the duty to consult type exercises, but I would see that as we take a rethink and a step back on consultation, we'll think about new strategies to better consult with the First Nations. I believe that part of our 2019 stakeholder engagement process included some of the First Nations, but I can't speak specifically to it. I wasn't 100% involved in that, so I can't tell you who was engaged or how they were engaged.
For wetlands to work best for water storage, they need to be as dry as possible. Do you support drainage and water level control structures to enable this?
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what the question's getting at there. So are we talking about draining the water so that we have the storage? Is that what the question's getting at?
Paul, if you want to just get on and clarify for Corey, please unmute your mic.
Here we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. You had a asterisk there under your, I believe it was water storage in the wetlands. And the way I understand it, going through the research, the wetland, if a wetland is full, it's not very useful that way. It's best if it's dry, so it has capacity. And do I understand you can, to get it dry, you need to move that water and then put in some sort of a control structure afterwards. So you can hold that water when you need it, you know, part of your managing your water flow. Is that part of your proposed system, you know, for controlling, thinking more floods, I guess?
Yeah, okay, I understand where you're going there. I think what we need to think about here is all of those various components. So in certain cases, having control structures may be appropriate for particular components, but to fully address some of the impacts related to water quality, you do need permanent storage. So it can't be a temporary storage. Otherwise, we don't have the management of some of those dissolved nutrients. So again, I think that there's various different components that we need to see on the landscape. So I think it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Okay, thanks.
As stakeholders and a watershed within the Lower Qu'Appelle River that drains into Manitoba, we have not been consulted or spoken with regarding this. Will you involve the watershed and stakeholders in discussions of the wetland policy? This would include the First Nations that reside in the Lower Qu'Appelle Valley.
Yeah, like I said, we're taking a rethink of the way that we're consulting and engaging with folks. So stay tuned for what that'll look like.
Is tile drainage included?
Yes.
Is there any target date for release of the wetland mitigation policy, even a draft in Saskatchewan?
So the demonstration projects have another year or so. So nothing will be coming out before then, because we've got a number of components that we need out of that piece of work. So I'm not going to give you a date, but I'll say a few years.
Due to COVID, we are seeing an increase in development in Saskatchewan, especially in trailer developments. Do the lack of wetland policy puts development at risk and sets our businesses up for failure? Why are we the only province in Canada that does not have a wetland policy? Does the WSA understand the effect of this is having on businesses?
I can't speak specifically to why we're the only province. I acknowledge that we are the only province that doesn't have one. We did have one in place. Technically, we do have one in place. It was the 1993 wetland policy, but this strategy supersedes that. And I think that we understand the effects, but I would offer that if people feel like you're not being heard, and you'd like to ensure that we are listening to that, please feel free to send us an email with those concerns so that we can make sure that they're considered as we continue to rethink and move forward.
How specifically is tile drainage being included?
Well, tile drainage is considered drainage, so it would require an approval. And we're still thinking about what the appropriate mitigation requirements would be, acknowledging that there may be some potentially different things, such as differing water quality issues associated with that. So in general, it would be either new or existing works. It would be associated with some sort of a wetland out there, and so it would be subject to the same approval requirements. What the mitigation looks like is still a work in progress.
Well, that looks like it's all the questions for today. I'd like to take this opportunity to, okay, one more. Will there be any effort to restore watersheds? Example, Quill Lakes.
I don't know that I can answer that yet, since we're still working on a bunch of the fundamental pieces. I don't know yet. Sorry, Jim.
All right. Well, again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Corey for her presentation today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today about Saskatchewan's agricultural water policy. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to having you again in April. Thank you for attending, everybody, and have a great day.